Thanks so much for joining us today. Can you give us the state of Idaho agriculture right now?
Melissa, let me put this in context a little bit. Idaho is a very small economy, the size of Rhode Island, and it has very big ag. Let's get that off the table right away. So what ag is really influencing the state's economy. When we're watching ag as a real dynamic type of engine of growth in the state. In 2022, we had record high cash receipts from farming. In 2023, we had record high farm income. It was up to cash receipts is up to $11 billion, up 28%.
And that's the money that farms get before they pay any of their bills,
yes,
anything like that. That's just the
top
line.
Mm-hmm. And in 2022, we our record. 2023, we had record high farming income, up 56% to $3 billion. These are phenomenal. When I first started this, it just dwarfs anything that we're talking about. Expenses in 2023 were up 20%, and revenues were up 27%.
So even though, in other words, costs rose for farmers, just like everybody else in 2022, they still got... 2023, fiscal year 2023. They received more income, more money coming in than the output that they had to give.
Yes.
In other words.
Yes.
We had you on a year ago to discuss how the Ukraine war may affect Idaho and United States agriculture. A year later, how has that played out?
Well, it hasn't been as bad as, Melissa, it hasn't been as bad as we thought it would be. We had a deal with the Russians and the Ukrainians where they could ship grain, little bumps in the road on that one, but it hasn't been as bad. And you have to realize that also Ukraine has not been able to import a lot of fertilizer, and a lot of their great farmland has been taken up with war, mined, or something like that. But it hasn't been as bad as it really was thought, and it hasn't been as bad as other things that affected agriculture at the time. It's been bad on those small countries that are desperately poor. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, some of those are just financially, the wheat in particular in those countries is astronomically priced.
And these are countries that imported wheat directly from Ukraine.
And Russia,
right.
And stuff like that. They were just embargoed on that, and and the prices were really bad. And it hasn't affected, though, the American consumer as much. Melissa, there's only about 8% of our dollar that you spend at the grocery store goes to ag production. And in stuff smaller than that, and say the old farmer's whine, there's only 4 or 5 cents in a box of Wheaties. That's absolutely true. And so when Wheaties go from 4 cents grain goes from 4 cents to 8 cents, double the price of grain, which hasn't happened. It's just pittance in a box of Wheaties or a loaf of bread or anything like that. It doesn't affect that very much.
But consumers across Idaho and the United States are still seeing increased costs at the grocery store. So if just pennies of that are going to the farmer, why are we seeing such huge increases
in the box
bills?
of Wheaties? Mm-hmm. It's transportation, largely diesel for trucking. Everything else, wages, salaries, costs of everything else like that has gone up. And since we're such a small part, farming is such a small part of that, it just hasn't gone up very much.
But so the rest of it is things like packaging and wages for the people who work, transportation and the transportation
Diesel.
Itself.
Yes.
From a policy perspective, the state legislature in particular, is there anything that Idaho lawmakers can do specifically to help Idaho ag workers?
Well, they have several big, one bill in particular is for licenses, and that's...
Driver's licenses for undocumented people.
Yeah, driver's license for undocumented labor. That's largely a liability type of problem for them. They just don't want to be hit with a huge lawsuit because their undocumented is driving their truck.
Their undocumented employees
Yeah,
are
is
driving a truck
yeah.
and then hit somebody.
Yes, they don't want to be hit with that. The other big issue that we're faced with in agriculture in the state is property taxes.
Like everybody else.
Yes,
right?
like everybody else. And the huge jump in property taxes are, borne by a lot by houses and housing, and they don't want that large increase in budget to be shifted to agriculture, other small businesses that have property that they don't want. They don't want those to be the decrease in housing. They don't want to be shifted to agriculture or other small business that property taxes. They're very adamant about not having to bear the whole liability of need for increased property taxes.
How about on the regulation front? Are there any issues that you've been keeping an eye on, whether it comes to water regulation or land use?
This is always a big problem in Idaho is water. Water, water, and water. The three big issues for ag is always water. And that we're working. We have a great year this year. It hasn't stopped snowing. It snowed here yesterday in Moscow. And stop already. We're having a great water year, but the Eastern Snake River Plains Aquifer that deal has kind of unraveled, that agreement, and that's going to be foremost, whether it's in the legislature or outside the legislature, that's going to have to be dealt with and get back on a sustainable basis again, so that we have a really stable basis to our water supplies in the state of Idaho. There's a lot of management, even increased management and increased expenditures by the state, and some regulatory, very unpalatable medicine that's going to have to be given to the farmers about this cutting their water use.
So at the end of the day, fiscal year 2023 has been good for farmers. As we get closer to 2024, what are you going to be keeping an eye on?
Well, I think we're going to we got to keep the receipts are not for a forecasted. I mean, the expenses are not forecasted to go up very much, as bad as they were in the past. I mean, we had fertilizer and stuff like this up 50%, and that's and what that causes, Melissa, is that in particular, dairy is our number one industry in the state. We have break-even points of about $16, $17 per hundredweight. They've crept up to about 2021. So you've got your break-even points are a lot higher in this and leverage a lot more money out there is these farm income. But we don't look at the expenses to go up that high, but the receipts are not looking that good for this year. And so that's what we got to really keep our eye on. Yes, there's some big increases in some grain prices and stuff like that, but you have to keep the eye on dairy, milk prices. That's when they just haven't been real, and spuds. And spud prices are up, but milk prices, we'll have to see as the year plays out, because it really can change within a few weeks, even with milk prices.
All right, Dr. Garth Taylor, University of Idaho, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Melissa.